Distinguished guests, colleagues and friends, we already heard a bit about the Arctic Science Ministerial that was held in Berlin just about 6 weeks ago. And I will tell you a bit more about the meeting, how we organized it. Not going too much into the detail of what the outcome was, because need this in the joint statement, but more talking about the process of how we organized it and what we learned from that process of organizing such a meeting and getting the message from the science into the policy, because that's what we did at the Science Ministerial. So it was certainly built on the first Arctic Science Ministerial that was held in Washington, D.C. in September 2016, and was organized by, it was a joint effort organized by the European Commission, by the Republic of Finland, and by Germany, and held in Berlin in October this year. And of course, the focus was very much on science and research in the Arctic and in relation to the Arctic. And the ministries that were invited were the ministries for science. So it was not an Arctic Council event, though of course the coordination with Arctic Council activities was important to us. And that was also why Finland was a partner and was invited as one of the 3 core organizers to make sure that the link to the Arctic Council is there. And then of course the participation of the Arctic indigenous peoples was extremely important. And of course there we worked through the channels of the Arctic Council and invited the 6 permanent participants of the Arctic Council. And all of them came to the meeting, which was very good. And we had more than 20 indigenous participants in Berlin for the Arctic Science Ministerial. It was a bit different from the first ministerial because it really included a scientific conference. So on the first day we organized a science forum, we called it, inviting all the countries, the organizations, the indigenous organizations to send their delegates to Berlin to really lay the foundation of the Science Ministerial and the ministerial meeting the next day. So we had 250 participants from 26 countries and discussing what all the countries are doing in terms of the science that contributes to the Arctic Science Ministerial and having presentations from all the participating countries and organizations in a very compact format with many panels and discussions on one day. We produced a little film of this science forum, a 2-minute film that was produced overnight and then next day was shown to the ministers so that they saw that there is really something to prepare this thing. And I think this film was pretty well received by the ministers. You will find, I'm just saying this, you will find all this material on the Arctic Science Ministerial website. We are currently reorganizing the website a bit, but in the next couple of days there will be a new version and all this material that I'm talking about today will be then available, including also all the films that were produced. So then in the evening, to have an opportunity for the scientists and their ministers to sit together and to talk and to just mingle, we organized a reception in the Natural History Museum in Berlin. So to which all the scientists, but also the participants of the ministerial meeting the next day were invited. So on the second day, we had the real meeting of the ministers. 25 countries and the European Union participated in this ministerial meeting. I think we had about 15 ministers present. In some cases, we had the ambassadors of the countries participating in the meeting. But in total, there were 26 governments meeting at the ministerial, and at the end signing the ministerial declaration or the joint statement of ministers, as we called it. So, and that was held in a conference center in Berlin, a very interesting setting. And of course, the indigenous groups, the 6 indigenous organizations, were sitting at the table during the ministerial meeting. So, without going into detail, of course, the highlights. First highlight was the joint statement that was signed by the ministers on the second day. And of course it goes into the direction that was already mentioned before in the previous presentations, generally improving and better coordinated international scientific cooperation in Arctic research. For better observations, for better available of Arctic data, for better coordination of infrastructure, use of icebreakers, stations, and so on, and all in terms of having better foundations for models and better predictive skill, which I believe is one of the key things that we need to develop in the Arctic. We need to have better forecasts and better models and better predictive skill for the Arctic. And then the second topic of the ministerial was We also talked about that in the earlier presentations. How is the Arctic connected to the rest of the globe? So what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, and we talked about that already today. And then the third priority, or the third theme of the ministerial, was the resilience and vulnerability of Arctic people and ecosystems. So what do we need to do as scientists to support sustainable development, to make sure that things that are already happening in the Arctic are being done in a way that they will not harm the environment and people living in the Arctic. So that was the third theme. And all the statements that were made by the ministers and signed in the declaration were directed towards these three overarching themes. So, as I said, there is a final report which is currently being finalized, so there are still some little pieces missing. And that final report includes, of course, first of all, the joint statement of ministers, but it also includes a summary of all the science that was contributed for the ministerial. So all the countries and organizations were invited to submit their science to the ministerial along these three themes that I mentioned. And this material was analyzed by a science advisory board and then compiled into a science summary. And that science summary is the core of this final report, of which you already find a raw version on the website. There's a final version which will be available very shortly to include also the preface of the ministers and the joint statement of the ministers. So, and then what we also did, and that's something that the US started for the first ministerial, all the partners, all the countries and organizations that participated in the ministerial were invited to summarize or synthesize their Arctic research program on 2 pages. So, and the final report also includes a 2-page summary of all the participating countries' research programs and activities, which I believe is extremely useful to have all these documents in one report. And also the indigenous organizations were invited, and also the international organizations participated in the ministerial, put together their science in a 2-page format. So the last thing I want to show you is a bit more what the lessons learned from the ministerial. So I think we had lots of positive criticism after the ministerial, which made us, of course, very happy and very proud. It was quite some work, as you can imagine, so I was never in my life that busy, I think, so preparing that conference. So, but I think it paid off. At the end, it was a very, very interesting, a very good thing. And of course, we now have to see how we do the transfer to Iceland and to Japan, organizing the third ministerial in 2020. So this is also one reason of why this Arctic Circle Forum is really interesting and important, because we can start talking about this. How do we hand over from Germany, Finland, and the European Commission to Iceland and to Japan, organizing the third one. So let me talk about the process. I think we learned from that. So first of all, we started by inviting all the governments, the European Union, the indigenous organizations, and let's say the most important international organizations to bring in their science. So to bring in what they did in terms of updates from the first ministerial, new activities for the second ministerial, and the 2-page Arctic research overview. We then established a science advisory board, which task was to analyze all this material. And this was hundreds of reports and hundreds of documents that had to be analyzed. And that was then synthesized in the science summary, which you find on the website. So, and this science summary then fed directly into the joint statement signed by the ministers. And I think that's important, because you see what the ministers were signing was something that was developed by the scientists. And we tried to document that also in the way we organized the meeting with the Science Forum, and then the joint reception in the evening, and then the ministerial on the second day. So, and that was kind of the way we tried to bring science into policy. Thank you.